Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. Today I am joined by Dr. Byron Waldron of Sydney University, and today we'll be continuing our rankings of the 3rd century emperors and the Tetrarchy. And today we'll be covering the first Tetrarchy, Diocletian, Maximian, Constantius I, and Galerius. Hello, Dr. Byron.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Right, so Diocletian is an epoch changer in many ways.
Literally so. The epoch of the Age of the Martyrs, a dating scheme begins with Diocletian.
One of the reasons why we have the Anno Domini system today is because the man that came up with it wanted something to replace the Diocletianic dating system which Diocletian came up with. So I believe he started dating years from the beginning of his reign when he was proclaimed emperor.
It's the Christians under him. They were doing it because they viewed his reign as such a sort of the beginning of a new age of martyrdom and the Christendom that arose out of those ashes. It seems to have become unpopular, perhaps because of the importance it laid at Diocletian's feet.
Right. In many ways, Diocletian is not only things change more generally for the Roman Empire in pretty much every aspect of life, it's the beginning of the end of the Principate and the beginning of the Dominate, which had been in a process of changing throughout the 3rd century, and we've seen that with people like Aurelian, Probus, and Gallienus making changes to the character of the empire beyond just enacting reforms. But it's really Diocletian that takes those initiatives and turns them into what's called the Dominate, which is derived from how he styled himself as Lord and Master rather than just Imperator and
Yes,
Princeps.
Dominus.
Republican tradition of the Roman Empire goes out the window under his reign, and he pulls back the curtain and reveals the Roman monarchy for what it is, and elevates it to something that the Romans hadn't really seen for some time. You get emperors that try and become very monarchical, like Domitian, but it's really Diocletian who manages to do that and also get away with it as well. He's not murdered.
Yeah, Domitian is an early example of that taking away the all these republican trappings and like the building program of Domitian, this huge palace with very imposing halls, and he would sit away from all the people at the banquet and kind of watch them as kind of a separate and quasi divine entity. And Diocletian is doing the same thing, but with more success now, I guess, partly because time has changed things.
Yeah.
It's just on that the term dominus, for example. Dominus had been used as an informal term to refer to emperors in, for example, literature of the 1st century AD. So it had been around a while, but it first started appearing on inscriptions referring to the emperors in the 2nd century. And then with Aurelian, it started appearing on coins produced by the imperial mints. So we're seeing this progression. Eventually, when Diocletian abdicates, we see a lot of coins with Dominus being used to refer to him.
I do also wonder if the acceptable appeal of monarchy for the Romans had something to do with the fact that lots of emperors were being proclaimed in the provinces and also never showing up in Rome, like Maximinus, in that you could have someone from Thrace become emperor and never go to Rome, so he doesn't have to worry about pleasing the Senate or following Roman traditions and like jump through the hoops that Augustus had to, in that he is a monarch, but he also has to make sure he doesn't act like one.
Yeah, sure. The Senate is increasingly irrelevant power broker. Yeah.
So I think Diocletian goes right at the top. I think he's an exceptional emperor. Not just in the fact that he was able to change lots of things, but his achievement as well. As much as Aurelian was responsible for reuniting the Roman Empire and restoring the world, it's Diocletian who really brings the 3rd century crisis to a final end. Not only brings it to an end permanently, which in many respects Aurelian failed to do, but he also sets up how the empire operates for the next 400 or so years. I mean, it does get adjusted by emperors such as Constantine and Justinian, who changed lots of things, but they're still working within Diocletian's framework. And you see all of these reforms not just like in the economy or the army, but it's the whole shop of things that you could reform. He reforms religion. He reforms or has policies related to religion. He reforms administration, the army, the whole political makeup of how the Roman Empire operates. So you have the Tetrarchy. He continues to revive the economy, and also introduces a imperial budget and reforms the annonum militaris, so that rather than a ad hoc emergency levy, it becomes a proper institution to fund the army without necessarily having to rely on the worthless currency he was having to deal with. So if his soldiers needed spears and provisions, he could tax that directly from his people and make sure his army continued to operate without having to set up dozens of mints to mint out worthless coins to pay his troops to buy those things. So that he managed to solve long term a lot of the problems that 3rd century emperors had struggled to contend with. I mean, his reign isn't perfect, and some of his reforms, in retrospect, can be criticized for future difficulties. So, like, the administration it does become prone to corrupt practices. So, I mean, one of the most famous examples is the corrupt governor of Africa during the reign of Valentinian, a guy called Romanus, who manages to get away with nicking everything from Tripolitantia and
Tripolitania,
yeah, and Lepsus Magna. He requisitions all of their supplies, then moves away and lets the Moors sack their surroundings, and then succeeds in quashing their attempts to rectify the situation. It could be quite difficult for people to get a direct line of contact with the emperor. But at the same time, the situation that had been the case before when Diocletian took power was that no one was really getting to emperor because a lot of the administration had started to break down, and administering the empire had crumbled quite a bit. There's like a rescript from the reign of Philip the Arab, where it's begging the emperor to do something and try and solve the situation. I think it's from Gaul, and the way it's framed, it sounds like that was never really addressed by anything.
It was often quite difficult to get to the ears of the emperor, regardless of whether it was the pre-Diocletianic or post-Diocletianic period. I think in the case, certainly a large bureaucracy does make that difficult as well. I suppose also one of the issues with the Valentinian period is
the empire is in crisis again by that point. I mean, Diocletian certainly had wars to fight, but Valentinian is constantly having to be on campaign, plus send out generals to fight various wars, like in the Great Conspiracy in Britain and the usurpation of
Mm.
Firmus.
And also Valentinian and Valens both had the the issue of because they were outsiders, they were sort of they were these quite a lot like the third century emperors. They were Balkan generals from the Balkans, and they seem to have viewed themselves as outsiders in relation to the aristocracy, and so they relied. Prosopographical studies by David Potter, for example, have shown this, that they appear to have relied quite heavily on a very select circle of aristocrats whom they trusted. And the problem with that's a reliable network to rely upon, but it also does mean that if one of the people within this inner circle, for example, Remigius, who I think was the brother of Romanus, if they're being corrupt, they're more likely to get away with it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also something to keep in mind about the Valentinian example. But certainly, I think establishing that bureaucracy, while it's a solution, it also, of course, brings different problems with it.
There are also some examples from Diocletian's own reign where the administration was starting to already show signs of some of its later detractions, like the proliferation of officials, so just bureaucrats inventing new offices for their friends to fill.
Right.
There's a letter from one of the governors of Egypt addressed to the Tetrarch saying that, can you send me a governor, and when you do so, you will need 5 or so officials for this, and that's all you need. The rest of that lot can be sacked, basically.
Right.
And there is a kind of an idea that bureaucrats are making jobs for their friends and just bloating out the imperial system. But at the same time, I think a good case can be made for a lot of cases where not corruption, or even in cases where you do have corrupt things going on, but they're still doing their jobs. You have the empire, you have the restoration of justice throughout the provinces, and a lot of the provinces, because they have been made smaller and 2 extra layers of administration have been placed on top, the organization of the empire to deal with military crises and at the same time civil problems is much improved. You don't really have the same breakdown of the administration that you do in, say, the 5th century, where you have the surprising case of the administration outlasts the Roman Empire itself in some places.
Right.
It's like
yes.
In Gaul and Britain, where things keep operating despite lacking an imperial direction.
Yeah, I mean that is quite telling that this post-Diocletianic administration is seemingly hardier than imperial authority itself.
And I get that kind of need to make Rome's institutions tough from the Tetrarchy. So we were saying before about how Valerian's system was a very good idea, but it kind of broke down before it could really get going. And Diocletian, right at the beginning of his reign, he appoints a soldier, Maximian, to look after the Western Empire, first as Caesar and then as Augustus. And you could also proxy Carausius in Britain as kind of like a third potential emperor. I mean,
sure.
The Tetrarch's relationship with him is hostile.
Yes.
But they do come to a agreement at some point. But you have, for most of Diocletian's reign, you have at least 2 or more emperors in charge of something. And in the 292, he adds 2 more emperors, Constantius and Galerius, as Caesars, so that no matter what happens, even, say, Diocletian is killed or Maximian falls ill or something, there's someone to replace them. If one of them does die, you still have 3 of them around the empire. And by having 4 emperors, the actual territories they have to look after are a lot smaller. So they don't really have the case of what Probus and Aurelian had to do, was basically try and be in all parts of the empire at the same time.
Be
Where
constantly on the move.
So you have great feats of logistics to your name, but at the same time you've got usurpers popping up everywhere, and you constantly have to go from frontier to fight back attacks from barbarians. Whereas the Tetrarchs, although they are being attacked from external enemies, like Constantius gets attacked by the Franks, he beats them off. You don't have that same need for the emperors to go around and constantly have to try and fend off the empire.
Sure, because there's literally one on every major frontier.
And also, they almost double up as well, because they have a Praetorian prefect each, who this is still the period when they had military obligations as well as civil ones. So reconquest of Britain after Carausius is murdered by the usurper Electus. It's Aureolus. No, not Aureolus.
Asclepiodotus.
Asclepiodotus, thank you, who leads the conquest of Britain with Constantius I.
Yeah, and Asclepiodotus seems to be the one who actually wins the major battle, because it was a two-pronged surprise offensive where it seems that Asclepiodotus landed on the southern coast of England and started moving east, and so Electus left London to meet him in battle and got defeated. Meanwhile, Constantius showed up with the other fleet and went straight to London and occupied the city while Electus was absent.
Which is where you get that famous golden medallion of
the Aris medallion. Yeah, you're right. There are 2 Praetorian prefects in addition to the 4 tetrarchs, and they still had military responsibilities. So, yeah, in a way, it's a college of 6.
Yeah, so I think it's these kinds of measures in that they aren't exactly perfect. So, like, the Tetrarchy does break down after Diocletian abdicates, but while he was in charge, you had 20 years of it working, and one could quite rightly argue that it works after Diocletian abdicates, that you didn't manage to have in the rest of the 3rd century crisis. I mean, even before, with people like Septimius Severus, his son murders his brother, Geta, and then he's murdered, and then you have a rival dynasty try and take over with Macrinus, and then you have Elagabalus is placed on the throne, and then he gets murdered because he's a lunatic, and then you have the whole problem with Alexander in that he's fine while there's no crisis going on, but as soon as there is, then the cracks really start to appear, and then you have a civil war after his death.
Yeah, it has to be said, in general, because of Rome's political traditions, which are republican and then become this sort of pseudo-republican principate veneer, this is not a society that's well set up to actually have lasting dynasties, because there are no rules of succession. You're not meant to acknowledge that there's actually a king. It's the Severan dynasty or the Constantinian dynasty or the Second Tetrarchy. They generally don't last. They tend to collapse within a couple of generations. It's an inbuilt problem within Roman dynastic practice, because it's sort of an unspoken rule anyway.
Diocletian's innovation of having these 4 emperors operating, and that you get the first smooth succession since the beginning of the 3rd century, that you're actually able to have Constantius Galerius become senior emperors, and then 2 more emperors take their place, without a revolt happening immediately, or the whole system falling apart. Well, I mean, you could argue about Constantius, but you could make the other argument of, had he lived, then the Tetrarchy could have continued fairly securely for another generation.
Sure.
Diocletian he's one of those emperors that he really changes things. He really changes the game, so to speak, about the empire of the Principate is long gone. At the beginning of it, it's on the way out anyway, in many respects. And he replaces it with a system which certainly does have flaws and buckles a bit in the 5th century and late 4th century, but at the same time, you could argue it's a far more resilient system than the one that Augustus set up.
Sure. I think I have to agree. I think Diocletian is an exceptional emperor. And I think there are many reasons why that is. Well, I mean, for a start, he takes power in 284. And if you put yourself in the shoes of people living at that time, they're going to be assassinated or overthrown in 2 to 5 years, because that's simply the norm at this point in time.
If you're lucky.
That's it. He may have only had a few months. He may have been defeated by Carinus or by Sabinus Julianus, the Praetorian prefect who took power in northern Italy around the same time that Diocletian usurped. And yet this guy lasts for 21 years and then abdicates at the height of his power and then continues to live for 8 years in retirement. Well, I go with 8 years. There's a bit of debate. One of the strangest things about Diocletian is when he actually died.
Yeah.
It's because it's not actually clearly known, but which is very strange. For survival alone, he almost immediately earns exceptional status. The crisis of the 3rd century, you can see how it pretty much, there'll be more crises to come after Diocletian abdicates, so to speak. There'll be political crises, albeit of a different nature. It's more of a crisis within the college, this sort of dynastic rival co-emperors crisis. But within his reign, we have sort of the last of these pseudo-separatist usurpations happening. Like we had the Gallic Empire in the 260s and 270s, and we had Palmyra as well around that time. You have the last of them with Britain and Northern Gaul under Carausius and his successor / killer Electus from 286 to either 295 or 296. It's a matter of debate depending on various sources. But we have the last of those. That regime is defeated. We have a final large usurpation in Egypt under Domitianus and Achilles that is defeated by Diocletian himself. He personally besieges Alexandria for 8 months, I think, and eventually forces his way into the city. There's a whole story about how he said that he would not cease the bloodshed until the gore had reached the knees of his horse, and then fortunately his horse slipped and slipped on the blood and got the blood on its knees, and so Diocletian called a stop to it. He and his co-emperors put down major usurpations, which were very typical of the 3rd century crisis, but they're sort of the last major usurpations of the period. Meanwhile, I mean, we'll get to it more with Galerius, but Galerius wins arguably the greatest victory over the Persians, to be won until perhaps the 7th century with Heraclius.
Battle of Santala.
Yeah, I mean, he chastens the Sasanians in a way that hadn't happened to that degree, I guess with the exception of the sack of Ctesiphon. But this was, Nasser was waiting for him. This was a battle that the Persians were prepared for, and they lost in a big way. And that happens in 297 or 298, and is another big kind of, the tides are finally turning sort of moment. So we have all these sort of major military and political achievements, but also Diocletian is the most hands-on emperor, the most interventionist, proactive emperor that the Romans have experienced since Augustus himself. And, he would arguably only be matched by a select few later emperors, such as Constantine and Justinian and Alexius, in terms of the degree to which he is politically proactively engaged with changing and transforming his empire.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of reforms he actually institutes and how innovative they are is quite staggering. You talked about the Tetrarchy itself, this college of 4 emperors, and unlike previous colleges, they're 4 active emperors. None of them are sort of nominal child Caesars. They're all active. They all have their own field armies. They can all legislate, although the degree to which any of them can issue edicts, they seemingly can, but the important empire-wide edict seems to be the preserve of Diocletian. And I guess, yeah, and I think that's an important aspect of this too. Diocletian hasn't actually divided the empire yet. What he's done is he's basically found 3 helpers who have important administrative and especially military powers.
He is almost like a first amongst equals in the Imperial College. But I think also he was very clever, just to add on to the Tetrarchy, in that initially he made Maximian Caesar, but then he also, the following year in 286, he makes him Augustus. So not only does he give him more autonomy to act on his own, with deferral to Diocletian, but he also, by making him at the top, he removes him as a political threat, because if he's already at the top of the pyramid, why would he revolt?
Exactly, and you can kind of see that with the Caesars too, because we know that Constantius in the late 280s was a successful general. He fought the Bosporan Sarmatians, perhaps the Roxolani, in the around 285 or 286 under Diocletian, before they're moving west, where he appears to have won within a particular panegyric to Maximian, indicate that Constantius won one of the few victories won over Carausius on mainland Gaul, and that he managed to force Carausius into a defensive posture with the English Channel as his barrier, his protection against.
Yeah, he managed to retake Boulogne. Would I be right in saying the Saxon shore forts are on both sides of the English Channel?
Yes.
Yeah, he manages to retake the Gallic half, which is the first real step to the reconquest of Britain.
And actually, the thing is, he does that that's like his first task as Caesar. But actually, even before that, he does it the first time, because the thing is, Carausius gets chased from Gaul in the late 280s and has to confine himself to Britain. But then Maximian appears, either through storms or through military blunder. It's evident that Maximian suffered a disaster attempting to cross into Britain. And then we can see from numismatic evidence that Carausius was able to re-establish his presence in northern Gaul. And so when you consider those things, and you consider the fact that Constantius is the general that we know of who actually had already managed to win a victory over Carausius.
Yeah.
Either Carausius or his Frankish allies. It's not entirely clear from the sources. And we also know that he captured a king in near Guntia. We don't know much more than that, but we know he managed to capture a German king. So you can see why it might be a good idea for Diocletian and Maximian to make Constantius, make him their Maximian's son-in-law, which they do before making him Caesar, and then actually just make him Caesar and adopt him as the son of Maximian. Because the reality is, not only would he be a very useful helper as an emperor, but you probably don't want a general more successful than Maximian not rewarded in a big way and not tied into the imperial family in some way. And so you can kind of like Diocletian's treatment of Maximian, you can kind of see the same treatment happening with Constantius, that it actually makes a lot of sense in terms of preventing usurpations to bring him into the imperial family and ultimately bring him into the imperial college. Galerius, and probably it's similar with Galerius, but not nearly as crisis-driven, since there was no Carausius in the east who was causing Diocletian serious problems at that time. Yes, I think the whole tetrarchic arrangement is a very clever one, and I think a big part of it is tailored towards preventing rebellions and usurpations. When you look actually at the years leading up to 293, when it's established, There isn't a great deal of foreign threat in those years leading up to 293 in a way that suggests that it wasn't a crisis on the borders. I think Diocletian, in his very problem solver manner, because that's really what he is, he's the ultimate problem solver emperor. He is thinking, well, Carausius is symptomatic of a larger problem that has been the case for decades now. How do we prevent the army and the provincial aristocrats from setting up usurpers against us? Is you have an emperor on every major frontier. And so you have Constantius near the Rhine, you have Maximian near the upper Danube and northern Italy, you have Galerius. Well, Galerius and Diocletian,
they swap territories.
Yeah, so sometimes one of them is on the eastern frontier and the other one is in the middle and lower Danube, in the Balkans, and which is also an indication that there aren't strong divisions yet.
Yeah.
There seems to be some kind of division between east and west, but we even see laws where, for example, the proconsul of Africa sends a letter to Diocletian asking for advice on how to deal with the Manichaeans. We actually have a couple of instances of people in Roman Africa in the west, receiving rescripts from Diocletian. Diocletian's sort of keeping this, as you say, first among equals control over the imperial college, but he's also using that college as this scheme of imperial presence and also, as you say, a scheme of succession. Likewise, I mean, his reforms, as you say, he divided the provinces into smaller units, which increase in provinces allows governors to deal with more limited geographical expanses. That means they can answer more petitions. It also means they have less power to challenge the emperor. And likewise, they don't have military power because, as you mentioned, the administrative and military cursus has been separated. And so there's these duces, these generals. The sphere of control could actually transcend the provinces sometimes. Like they could be, the different Pannonia provinces might have a single dux, one of these generals, while the different provinces would have separate governors. And so it's making things more labyrinthine, but it is allowing them to be more focused on their particular responsibilities and territories, and it's also weakening them if they should ever attempt to challenge the emperors.
Yeah, because you need to have a larger range of support. You can't be the governor of Mauritania and revolt. You have to get your praeses in charge of the administration to join in. You need to make sure the person responsible for troops is on board.
You can imagine that, as actually the contemporary Christian author Lactantius indicates, people don't like change anyway.
Yeah.
And people are suspicious of change. And we know that Lactantius, for example, is already a very critical writer of the Tetrarchs because of their persecution of the Christians. He exaggerates, for example, Diocletian's expansion of the army as if it were more than quadrupling the size of the army.
Yeah.
And he basically is one of the first known literary author to condemn Diocletian's reforms from that angle. And I mean, he's already a hostile source, but also, I suppose, it's a major change for the Roman Empire, and it is going to carry problems with it, but it is also in and of itself quite a new thing for the Romans to have that level of big
change
government.
Happen.
Yeah. I might just quickly rattle off a few more important reforms just so that they're not left unsaid, because he is also the first emperor to create the legal codices, the Hermogenean Code and the Gregorian Code. So he's a precursor to the Theodosian Code and the Justinian Code. He creates that precursor, which makes the issuing of laws much easier for administrators because they have these handy go-to codices.
Because you had so many emperors trying to deal with the both military and administrative issues of the empire, you had this huge raft of rescripts for all sorts of things that wasn't really codified in any way. And by having these law codes, you could condense these down into a usable set of laws.
Certainly. Yeah, it makes it much more efficient. The taxation reforms, as you mentioned, he created for the first time this it's a 5-yearly census of all the provinces in the empire. They through the census they know exactly what finances they will require, and they can ask for it based on what each household is able to provide. So they've created these units of measurement that will enable that to happen. It means both a more efficient taxation system and also ultimately more equitable. It means, in theory, no one is suffering too badly from exceptional requisitions based on crises, that there's already an established system of knowing what people can provide and what the government will need each 5 years. He had the coinage reforms, he revalued the currency. So he's putting all this effort into attempting to make the currency more
valuable.
Yes, yeah. His imperial self-representation is also innovative. He presents himself as Jovius, which sort of implies some kind of genetic link to Jupiter or some kind of close connection to Jupiter without ever saying it. And he wears bejeweled sandals, so it's all going towards this quasi-divine image.
I was just going to say, you have a big revival and emphasis on the imperial cult during Diocletian's reign. You have this building up of the emperor is a descendant from an god, and he's almost semi-divine in himself.
And he brings Maximian into that because he makes Maximian Herculeus, which also makes clear Maximian's subordination.
Because he's a demigod, not a full god like Jupiter.
Yeah, and he's sort of the son of, and he's the son of Jupiter, and he's not the supreme deity. And yet, at the same time, they also present themselves as brothers, which is interesting because that's, I would argue, meant to appeal to the soldiers. That's brotherhood. That sort of metaphorical brotherhood was, just as it is today, comrades in arms, brothers in arms. That was a thing in Roman society. And Roman laws even acknowledge it as a thing that had legal force for wills, for example. It may well be the case. Certainly the sources claim it, but it may be propaganda. Even if it's propaganda, it's still, important because Diocletian and Maximian, either they presented themselves this way or they actually were comrades from the Roman army, that they knew each other from the Roman army and they were buddies. And so Diocletian made his metaphorical brother, his military brother, Western emperor.
The idea of brotherhood between the tetrarchs was also a good way of showing off internal stability. So it's like you have the two pairings of the tetrarchs are in harmony with each other. I mean, this is something that Clausius himself tries to get across, that he is a usurper and he isn't part of the Tetrarchy, but he mints coins with hands grasping each other to show collegial peace with his friends. He also mints coins with his and also their faces on them. They're all friends together, and I think that reflects also with the Tetrarchy.
Yeah, I mean, there's this potent language of harmony, and I think interestingly, Diocletian's the tetrarchic administrations seemingly they like to switch depending on the context between showing that Diocletian is the senior emperor, which you see in some artworks, and in titulature, like for example Jovius. That and between but no, these emperors all look the same and they're embracing one another and they're sort of finding all these different ways to appeal to an empire, and I think particularly to the armies, to make sure that the armies understand that this is a united imperial college that can't be usurped against. I guess to quickly go over some issues with Diocletian. Certainly, the Tetrarchy doesn't last. The Historia Augusta has a great assessment of who Diocletian was as an emperor. He basically says that this was an emperor who was always thinking about what he could do to better the empire, and he was sometimes overbold about it. He was sometimes overly ambitious, but this was a good emperor and a proactive emperor and a real kind of thinker of an emperor. Certainly we can look at Diocletian and see mistakes, and I think that's to be expected from such an ambitious politician as he was. Yeah. Because we can look at the Prices Edict, for example, in 301, where he tried to put a maximum cap on what price things could be. And there's this, you get these huge inscriptions listing all these items and how much at most they can cost. Yeah.
it's really meticulous as well. It's like the price of not just like simple things like the price of wheat or silk, but it's like the price of hiring a cart for a day or something like that. And it's like
Yeah.
you've got these ambitious ideas, and
Yeah.
it does come from a good place. He is trying to stop the increase of prices, which has been a result of inflation of the currency. But that's not how you bring prices down or reduce inflation.
And like what we discussed with Aurelian, the thing is, I guess that the problem is Romans don't have the understanding of the economy that we have. I mean, there's also hubris there.
Yeah.
This is clearly someone, and this is late in his reign. Maybe he's getting a bit of an aura of I can pull anything off now.
His own propaganda.
Yeah, because I mean, and you can sort of understand why this guy still hasn't been overthrown for anything. He's doing well, but I guess also, he doesn't have that understanding of the economy that we do, and unfortunately, his prices edict. But yeah, it causes inflation. That vendors take their goods off the market because they can't afford to commit to those prices. Likewise, the great persecution of the Christians. Is again very late in his reign. It's the last 2 years of his reign. Having won all these wars and having succeeded on all these economic and political fronts and administrative fronts and legal fronts, he decides, well, let's change the empire spiritually. Let's finally stop this Christian problem because they're refusing to sacrifice, and that's endangering this empire. That's why that lack of religiosity on the part of the Christians, which in pagan eyes made them, well, atheists. They explicitly call them atheists. That's the reason why this empire has had such a bad time these last few decades. And so he finally tries to do something about that. I mean, some of them do agree to sacrifice, which causes the Donatist schism.
And also get reports of officials that they'd say that person X has done a sacrifice when they haven't, because they don't really fancy executing large numbers of their
because
people they know. And
that's it. Not every governor is a sadist.
So like you have a very famous example of Constantius, which may or not be propaganda, but where he gets the edict and he decides to demolish Christian churches, but doesn't persecute anyone.
Yes, one of the few instances we can find of one of the tetrarchs refusing to only following Diocletian's orders.
The letter
minimal
of his persecution, but not the spirit.
Yes. And of course, that persecution causes a lot of troubles. And
you get letters from it as well, like St. George.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and St. Sebastian. It becomes a sort of storytelling period where you can create new martyrs out of the existing context. And I guess the last big thing is, the Tetrarchy ultimately not working. And I guess it was a short-term solution, and presumably Diocletian was trying to make it a long-term solution because he was setting up this system of succession, this scheme of succession. But it's one of those arrangements that was working so long as Diocletian was there to hold it together, as far as we can tell. And because clearly he had a lot of, he had exceptional influence over those three colleagues, it appears. It's sort of amazing that they could function the way they did. And I think a lot of that does come down to Diocletian's personal influence. And that is sort of a trope of 4th century historiography, that he was an extremely influential person over his colleagues. Yeah. Julian, in his satire, The Caesars, has Diocletian enter this fictional banquet of the gods with the other three tetrarchs essentially linked arms dancing around him. But yes. But yeah, it was an unusual arrangement that worked in securing a stable 21 years. But yeah, it ultimately didn't work as a long-term solution. There's a lot of debate in modern scholarship about why this happened. I know a lot of British scholars favor Lactantius, who claims that Diocletian didn't co-opt Constantine and Maxentius, the sons of Constantius and Maximian, respectively, because Galerius basically pressured him into it. I guess we can deal with this a little more when we get to Galerius. But, for example, German scholarship is very much on the other side of that, which is that Lactantius this serves his invective. And I'm inclined to agree with that this is it's a subversive kind of invective what he's doing, where there's this trope of the all-controlling Diocletian, and he's sort of turning him into an impotent, frail old coward in his account. And I think what really this is Diocletian is a man of his time. He is someone who took power and who rose through the ranks probably he probably entered the army in the 260s or something. And he saw what happens to dynasts without military experience, like Quintillus or Florian, or the sons of Gallienus, the grandsons of Valerian. The third century is just not a good look for successful dynastic succession, even compared to the succession of other emperors. Like, there's been a period where succession in general is difficult to pull off. The most successful emperors of this period, in the eyes of someone like Diocletian, would be Aurelian and Probus and Claudius Gothicus, people who were career officers. And so he is relying on career officers like Maximian and Galerius and Constantius and the Severus II and Licinius. But ultimately, I guess the problem is, for all his other success, by 305, he has effectively established a dynasty whether he likes it or not.
Yeah.
And he clearly has underestimated the degree to which Constantine and Maxentius actually have an aura of legitimacy because of the success of the Tetrarchs, even though it seems he's still thinking in terms of, well, we need a career officer, and then maybe Constantine and Maxentius will have enough military legitimacy eventually to join the Imperial College, but they're not quite there yet. It's a topic of a lot of debate, but that's my take on it. I think he was a very ambitious character who didn't always make the right decision, but that's sort of what you expect from someone like that.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say it should be completely ruled out, because Galerius, being Caesar, would have been in a very prime position to affect Diocletian's decision.
And I should add nuance to that. I do agree that there's, these things are never black and white. And it would not surprise me that Galerius did have some influence over the decision. I mean, the two people who succeeded, the two new Caesars, were both friends, one was a nephew of Galerius.
Yeah.
And there's every reason to believe Galerius was an influential figure after winning such a notable victory over the Persians and often being in the same palace as Diocletian in a way that Constantius and Maximian rarely were. I mean, Diocletian had seen Maximian all of 3 times, perhaps, within that 21-year period, which is kind of amazing. Galerius was able to tailor things for himself, but I think also Diocletian had a very untraditional understanding of succession anyway, because, I mean, he also did abdicate, seemingly to supervise his own succession, because he could have understood it would be a controversial succession, perhaps. And
Maximian to do it as well, and a couple of years less than he had. So
Constantine and Maxentius still exist no matter who becomes Caesar. So you kind of want to control this succession in a careful manner. And yes, he's trying to make Maximian abdicate as well. And so he does have an unconventional approach to the succession. And I think he's probably wanting to give room to Constantius and Galerius to actually have positions that they can be promoted into, that because Constantius seems to be a similar age to Maximian, at least, and we don't really know the age of Galerius, but we know that, for example, no woman is called an empress in this period, or an Augusta, which again sort of suggests this unusual approach to dynasty. Likewise, no sons ever appear. Their imperial status is not recognized during this period. Like, we have an inscription of Maxentius before he became emperor, and he is referred to as man of senatorial rank, whereas his wife, a daughter of Galerius, is woman of most noble rank, which is, so in other words, biological sons have lesser status than the imperial women, which is interesting. So something's going on there that Lactantius isn't going into. That there's something else about Diocletian's approach to dynasty and succession. But also, I totally agree that the new Caesars are allies of Galerius, and so Galerius was in a position to influence him. So I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
What's really going on?
So Maximian, what do you think of him, Byron?
I think he's a bad emperor.
I would feel sorry for him, but no, I don't. So I mean, at the beginning of Diocletian's reign, he is quite effective in dealing with the Bagaudae, who are a large group of bandits in Gaul who had rebelled, I think, just against the Roman Empire in a way, because they were just out to look after themselves, because emperors to really watch over Gaul, which might give you an idea of the character of Carinus. Immediately after Carinus is dead, or maybe even a little bit before, and so there's a whole school he manages to sort out, which is to his credit, but he fails to invade Britain, and in fact his handling of Herausius is the whole reason for his revolt and the independence of Britain as a rival empire. I think it's also perhaps a little telling that when Constantius is made emperor, he's given Spain, Gaul, and eventually Britain. Maximian is given... No, wait, Constantius is just given Gaul, isn't he? And Britain.
Actually, yes, he gets Spain later when the Augusti abdicate.
But Maximian, he receives Italy, Africa, and a little bit along the upper Danube. So he isn't really given a major frontier to protect, which I do wonder if Diocletian has appointed someone more militarily capable in the west, because he has two major frontiers to defend: the Rhine, which has quite a lot of troops stationed on it, and eventually Britain, which also has huge numbers deployed there. The Rhine and Britain, definitely in the Principate, roughly had the same number of troops deployed there. So he's given a lot of responsibility, whereas Maximian is kind of shunted to the side a little bit to look after the civilian provinces.
He actually, I mean, it's interesting that he doesn't actually lead really many campaigns at all after Constantius becomes Caesar. The only campaign against a foreign enemy is an African campaign in the late 290s when he was dealing with the Quinquegentiani, a Moorish coalition. It didn't, for example, earn him a victory title. And I suppose there isn't a precedent for actually earning, a Mauricus, as a victory title, but it doesn't seem to have been the most significant of victories. And he otherwise spent a lot of his time after Constantius was made Caesar based in Milan or Aquileia in northern Italy, not doing much that has made its way into the sources.
I mean, perhaps you could say, just arguing from silence, that he is spending that time enacting Diocletian's reforms in those provinces of Italy, which are important provinces in a civilian sense. They are more, it's like Africa is the breadbasket of the West. Italy is where Rome is, although none of the Tetrarchs use it as their capital. And also Upper Danube, although quite a small frontier in comparison, is still a very volatile part of the frontier. So perhaps he is spending more time introducing Diocletian's reforms there. But his reign, he does get quite a lot of panegyrics to him, which is quite interesting. There's not really anything that really stands out about his reign.
Yeah, I mean, to me, so his two main positives, I'd say, are his military successes, because he did defeat the Bagaudae, and he also there were Heruli and another tribe. I think there's 4 different tribes actually in 285, 286 who invaded Gaul, and they were probably part of the reason why there were these peasant rebellions. Was the German invasions had flared up again, perhaps exploiting the civil war between Diocletian and Carinus. Since Aurelian's overthrow of the Gallic Empire, it's possibly the case that Probus was still having to deal with the aftermath of how many soldiers were killed as a result of Aurelian's victory at the Catalaunian fields, where he basically, destroyed the Gallic Empire, the Gallic army, and that would have weakened the Rhine frontier, because Aurelian had to deal with that a bit in the last year of his reign as well. And so Gaul is needing an emperor, And the peasant rebellions seem to reflect that, and Carinus spent a good deal of time in Gaul as well, seemingly for that reason. But yes, he does defeat this large series of, this series of Germanic invasions in 285 or 286. He then defeats another invasion, supposedly on the day he entered his first consulship on the 1st of January in 287. Supposedly, there's a whole panegyrical description of how he put on the consular robes and then quickly had to put on the military, politamentum, because suddenly the Alemanni were invading. And as a result of that, he then actually crossed into Germania and ravaged Alemannia. He also appears to have done a fair bit of divide and conquer. He seems to have been supporting the Burgundians, who were kicking the Alemanni out of their traditional homelands. And so the Alemanni had to move into the Agri Decumates between the upper Rhine and the upper Danube. So he had these successes. As I mentioned, he did have that Moorish campaign later, but he also became much less active militarily once Constantius became Caesar. And yes, perhaps he was playing more of an administrative role because he presumably had, he was the second in command of the empire, so presumably he did do a fair bit from an administrative perspective. Also, I guess my other point I'd give in his favor is he was, despite only seeing Diocletian on a number of occasions, 3 occasions really, there are 3 known events when Diocletian traveled west and met up with Maximian. He was clearly very loyal to Diocletian. I mean, he agreed to abdicate, well, despite there being no precedent for that. I mean, the only precedent we have is Tetrarchy, and that was in the context of a civil war, his impending doom as Aurelian was approaching. So he clearly needed help getting rid of Carausius, that he tried this. We know from the panegyric of 289 that he was preparing this fleet on the inland rivers of Gaul with the intention of contesting control of the English Channel and invading Britain. And then the panegyric of 291, there is radio silence about what happened there. And then 2 years after that, Constantius is made Caesar, and then he immediately marches against Carausius's possessions in Gaul because Carausius has managed to reassert himself in Gaul. We know from other literary accounts that Carausius was clearly doing quite well militarily.
I think if you were to end Maximian's career there in 305, I'd probably put him in decent. But he comes back and makes a lot of trouble for a lot of people. So he's partially responsible for the death of the future emperor Severus II, helps his troops defect to Maxentius, his son, and then eventually turns on his own son Maxentius, and then flees to Constantine, who he also betrays, and eventually Constantine gets sick of him trying to murder him, so he forces him to commit suicide after besieging Massalia, where he's holed up.
Exactly. He would have been a fine emperor if he had abdicated in 305, and that was that. But his last 5 years of existence, for me, almost undo it all, because it's just such a sad odyssey of political failure and impiety. Maxentius takes power in Rome and invites his father to help him, and, I guess understandably, he helps his son. And if that was what was going on, if he was helping his son because he understood that, well, if my son gets defeated by Galerius and Severus II, he's going to be killed, that would make sense to me. I could forgive that. But
he uses it as a route to regain power.
Yeah, he turns against his own son. He tries to overthrow Maxentius. And so at that point, he's very difficult to sympathize with that for me. Like, that is...
I believe the technical term is a git.
Right.
He's not the most pleasant character after he abdicates.
He's challenging Galerius as the supreme, the senior ranking emperor. That seems to be his real game. He wants to be the head of the imperial college now that Diocletian has abdicated. obviously Galerius isn't going to accept that because, Diocletian told him he could be, this is his imperial college now. And he's overthrown Severus II, who is then executed by Maxentius. Yeah, he tries, there's this whole scene where he accuses Maxentius of essentially, a disastrous emperor for Italy and for Rome in front of the soldiers, the Praetorians, and the other legionaries in Rome. And he tears the purple cloak from Maxentius' shoulders. And Maxentius jumps down to the soldiers for support, jumps off the podium and joins them. And the soldiers are, just they're livid with Maximian for doing this to his own son.
Yeah.
He clearly was politically outplayed by Maxentius in a big way. And I think, one thing Maxentius did so well was, while Maximian was in Gaul trying to win an alliance with, and succeeding in winning an alliance with Constantine, Maxentius was actually defending Rome against Galerius, the defeater of the Persians, and succeeded in defending Rome. And so Maxentius had serious credentials and was able to outplay his father. And then his father, Maximian, then tries to do the same thing to Constantine, and quite rightly is forced to commit suicide at that point. It's a depressing last 5 years for him.
Yeah. I feel there is a level of I feel I can't put him in mediocre for his later career. It's such a I think that's the other thing. He does all of this stuff, but none of it works out for him either.
Yeah, he's not very good at it.
There's a serial failure in terms of the Tetrarchy Game of Thrones.
You would think the army would actually be very loyal to him, and indeed that's why Maxentius wanted his help in large part, because he knew that Maximian would be a drawing card for the legions under the command of Severus II, because Severus II had basically taken over Maximian's legions. But then Maxentius is able to take those legions from right under Maximian. His son is cleverer than he is, I'd say. Yeah. You can see from the beginning that there's a power struggle between the two of them, because actually Maxentius doesn't take the title of Augustus until it's like 8 months or something. There's an 8-month period between his usurpation and actually taking the title Augustus. And it seems that there's this tension between the two over what they're actually doing. Are they both emperors? Is it just that Maxentius is an emperor and is he being helped by his father? Are they going to be joining the Tetrarchic Imperial College, or are they their own thing? And it seems there's a real, you can kind of see that with the coinage, who they're honoring on the coinage versus who they're honoring as consuls, where, for example, Galerius is absent from the coinage, which is perhaps the influence of Maxentius, whereas Galerius has been honored as consul at the beginning of 307, perhaps Maximian trying to get himself back into the Imperial College. Like, there's all these tensions, and basically it's a political battle that Maximian loses. He attended the conference at Carnuntum where Diocletian briefly returned from retirement in 308 and basically was there to tell Maximian to retire a second time, which Maximian temporarily did. Although, again, that influence of Diocletian on display, that he could even at that point be like, no, you've got to step down. Also Diocletian was there to help Galerius set up Licinius as the new Augustus. I guess it's difficult because I do respect how much Maximian was loyal to Diocletian during those 20 years, because that was a core part of what made the Tetrarchic period a stable period.
Yeah, especially the 280s, where I think that's probably the best part of Maximian's career, because he is doing most of the stuff in the West. I mean, as in the Carausius affair is perhaps the main failure of that part of his reign, but the rest of the 280s is he deals with the Bagaudae, he starts to re-establish control and the administration over Gaul, and starts to implement the policies of Diocletian and restores the frontiers and all the rest of it. And then his passes the baton to Constantius when he takes control. But yeah, it's really a decline for Maximian after Constantius enters the scene.
Yeah, it's sort of like if 285 to 293 was all we had, I'd say he'd be a good emperor. Like the Crassus thing isn't great, but he's otherwise a good emperor. He then sort of loses a bit of luster during the first Tetrarchy, but then again, as you say, he may well just be more. He's passed the baton on, and he's more administratively inclined at that point.
Ancient historians are less interested in the pen rather than...
That's certainly true. Eutropius, incidentally, does view him as a bloodthirsty emperor, and there does seem to have been an instance in around 302 or so where we know from an inscription a very prominent senator who had held various positions since the 290s, Helvius Dionysius. He suffered damnatio memoriae. His name was cut out of the crossed out on the inscriptions.
Right.
That might be what Eutropius and also Lactantius refer to when they refer to him as killing senators. Because, I mean, killing senators is a bit of a trope, but Eutropius isn't writing invective, unlike Lactantius. So there may have been some instance where Helvius Dionysius was based in the West. So Maximian did kill at least one senator, possibly with good reason. But that seems to be one of the reasons why Eutropius views him pretty unfavorably. Mm.
So you've put him in bad.
I'm thinking so. Maybe Paul would better acknowledge his successful earlier reign.
I'll put him in, I think, incompetent, because beginning of his reign is good, and
Sure.
it is an unfortunate decline for him. Almost his incompetence grows with his age, but I think that's probably most fitting for him. So that's Maximian. What is your opinion of Constantius I?
I think he was good.
From everything we do know about him, he comes across as a very successful general. He retakes Britain from Electus. He defeats all of his opponents along the Rhine frontier. And I think that's the other strange thing about Constantius's reign, is that his reign very much passes in silence for a lot of later histories. They kind of record that he became emperor, retook Britain, didn't persecute Christians, and then died. Is kind of how his reign generally plays out. I mean, there may be various reasons for why that is, such as future Constantinian propaganda.
Yeah, I think he's a good emperor. He was clearly very good at military campaigning, which is mostly what we know about him. He succeeded against Carausius and Electus, the successor of Carausius, where Maximian had failed. You know, he retook Gaul as a general from Carausius, and then once he became Caesar, he had to retake Gaul again, which he succeeded in doing. He then eventually, a two-pronged invasion that we mentioned before, managed to reconquer Britain itself. He had various successes against the Germans. He defeated the Franks. He defeated the Alemanni. I think he ended up winning the Germanicus 4 times, and the panegyrics make clear, like, they refer to the 4 different instances when this happened. So it shows, maybe it was even 5 times. He was clearly very successful on the Rhine frontier. Yes, which I think is the first instance of the Picts even being mentioned in history, actually. He'd actually won that victory already, because there's a diploma, a military diploma, that refers to Constantius as Britannicus Maximus II. So he had won Britannicus twice by that point in time, once for the defeat of the British regime and once for the defeat of the Picts. So yeah, he was a successful military emperor. He's probably the most difficult tetrarch to actually get an idea of who he was, because, like Claudius Gothicus, he is integral to Constantine's self-representation as the father of Constantine. And so he's very much the perfect emperor in how he's described.
He does
and in
some kind of Marcus Aurelius treatment in that for Roman historians of the period, in that you start with the perfect emperor, like Marcus Aurelius, or like John II Comnenus, and then you go down and you talk about all of the horrible emperors like Licinius and so on, and then you end with the great savior Constantine. I think there is a lot of Constantinian propaganda, perhaps purposefully obscuring his father's reign, just to make him completely perfect. But at the same time, I feel with propaganda, you usually see traces of the truth that's being covered up. So, like with Constantius II's massacre of his relatives, there's an initial attempt to try and cover things up, and the attempt fails because his involvement is so blindingly obvious to so many people that eventually he drops the facade and just kind of goes on the it was a necessary evil route rather than the I definitely didn't massacre all of my relatives. And you don't really see that with Constantius I. You told about his very successful military campaigns. I don't think he loses a single campaign.
No, yeah, he seems to be undefeated.
So there's that in his to his credit.
Mm.
His policy towards the persecution possibly covered up in a way, but at the same time, I think it's perfectly believable that the Tetrarch, which is the furthest away from Diocletian, and seems to have this congenial personality from what comes across in the sources, would be able to get away with demolishing churches rather than persecuting and killing Christians as well.
Sure, because it's only so great a degree that Diocletian can really, as you say, impose upon someone that far away from him.
And I think also the first persecution edict doesn't actually take place in the West. It's the second one that they finally start persecuting Christians. Communication issues of having to send this stuff over vast distances. But I think also the first persecution edict is more localized in Diocletian's part of the empire.
Yes, because his very first act of persecution against the Christians seems to be specifically the soldiers in the imperial army and the officials in Diocletian's court.
Yeah.
That seems to be the very first one that he does, and that does seem quite Nicomedia centric.
Yeah.
Where
and he also gets a bit annoyed
based.
that the Christian cathedral in Nicomedia is larger than his palace, or overshadows his palace. So Constantius, he doesn't really do anything that would catapult him into the annals of being great, but he is a very competent emperor. The fact that he's trusted with these two highly important commands in Britain and the Rhine show the amount of trust Diocletian, and I suppose Maximian for that matter, has in Constantius and his abilities. And he also seems to get on with his job, really. He doesn't seem to come across as someone who's really interested in court politics and intrigue like Galerius and Maximian.
Yeah. Oh well, I'll get to that in a moment because there is an interesting argument about that. So there is a sheen of propaganda, but I think yes, you can see. I mean, we can see how propaganda has changed some things in the sense that Eusebius claims that Constantius didn't persecute the Christians at all, and yet we know from Lactantius, well, he did demolish churches, and we do have sources showing us a closer, more accurate vision of who the man was before Constantinian propaganda took too much of a hold. Because also Lactantius is writing much earlier in the Constantinian period than Eusebius's Life of Constantine was written.
And we also have the Latin panegyric, which would have happened almost immediately after his conquest of Britain, which again is definitely of a particular genre, but it's also fresh from the press, so to speak. Also quite a funny little note for Constantius I is that there's a milestone of Carausius in Britain that was found. And, well, a milestone just has the emperor's name and then how many miles it is to settlement. And Carausius's name has been crossed out, and it's been flipped over, and Constantius's name has been put on the top instead.
Right. Yeah, great. I think the only example that kind of shows him in a tight spot is in Eutropius, where the Alemanni marched on his position in somewhere in Gaul. They got the jump on him. They surprised him and his army. And there's this whole bizarre scene that Eutropius describes where Constantius had to be hauled over the walls, like lifted up to the wall via a crane. But then within the same day, Constantius sallied forth from the town and completely defeated the Alemanni. That's the only claim of a troubled moment in his military career.
Yeah.
The only criticism I have, I suppose, is his potential involvement in the post-Diocletianic. So Bill Ledbetter, in a book on Galerius, he makes this interesting argument. After Diocletian and Maximian abdicate, the Tetrarchy, the borders between the four different regions of the Tetrarchs become more solidified.
Yeah.
There are greater limits now on the degree to which each emperor can impose upon another emperor's territory. And we also see the beginning of each emperor having their own praetorian prefect now. Bill Ledbetter, I don't remember the details, but there is numismatic evidence for this greater division as well. Although there are also, of course, key thematic similarities between, say, Galerius' region and Maximianus' region, because they were very close allies for a while. That Bill Ledbetter makes the argument Constantius was kind of losing out in 305 in the sense that, so his son Constantine wasn't going to be co-opted into the Imperial College, and even though he was technically going to be the senior ranking emperor, because he had been the senior ranking Caesar, the two new Caesars were both partisans of Galerius. We do see in how Galerius proceeds to manage things that it does look as though Galerius is able to legislate in Italy and Africa, in Severus's parts of the West, in a way that seemingly transcended the nominal seniority of Constantius. Eutropius, I think, is the one who says that Constantius kind of stepped back from controlling Italy and Africa through Severus, that he sort of allowed this to happen, which could be taken to be, does sort of suggest someone more interested in getting on with the job in Gaul and Spain and Britain. It's possibly the case, as Bill Ledbetter argues, that a succession this controversial ought to have had there should have been negotiations attending it. There would have been complex negotiations, you would imagine. Yes, so that Maximian and Constantius don't feel completely put out by it. And Bill Ledbetter wonders whether, and I think David Potter agrees with this as well in his book on Constantine, that maybe Constantius persuaded Diocletian to impose these stricter divisions between territories as a concession. Right. Like, he will allow the de facto domination of Galerius over 3/4 of the empire. But if that's going to be the case, then there needs to be stricter divisions between everyone's territories. And that's sort of his conjecture. There's no source actually says that, but we can see that these stricter divisions come into place, and we can surmise that there ought to have been, it was a controversial succession. You would imagine there would have been some kinds of attempts at placating him so that he didn't go rogue and get upset with the arrangement and do something he might regret. Yeah, it's a conjecture, but it's an interesting one that maybe does suggest that Constantius may well have been understandably upset that he couldn't just cop Constantine. Several sources do claim, although this might just be Constantine saying it, we can't tell, but some sources do claim that Constantius did, when he was dying, present Constantine to his troops and presented him as his successor, which he had the right to do as the senior ranking emperor. It does also suggest that maybe he wasn't that pleased with what happened in 305 in the preceding year. But I mean, I think he's a good emperor. He's clearly a good military emperor, and he's a reliable administrator. Maybe he had a role in the increasingly divided empire, but that's also a conjectural argument.
Do you think that perhaps part of why Constantius was going to lose out to Galerius in many ways is because he was so far away from Diocletian, that he had to, if he was going to communicate with Diocletian, which Galerius could do with a lot more ease, that anything he said would take months to go and come back, whereas Galerius could speak to Diocletian to his face.
I mean, that's true. It would have been a very frustrating process for Constantius, I imagine. Whereas Galerius is, we know on occasion he is in the very same palace as Diocletian in Nicomedia.
It's ironic, though, that it's the death of Constantius that causes the whole Tetrarchy to fall apart.
That period when he is the nominal senior ranking emperor, it in itself does seem to have been a stable period, certainly. Just quickly on Nicomedia, since we didn't mention it, but I guess that's just a quick important point about the Tetrarchs. They are precursors to Constantine and Constantinople, in that we have these places like Nicomedia, and in Constantius's case, Trier. The Basilica of Constantine in Trier may have been originally built under Constantius, and we're seen building these, focusing on these imperial residences far from Rome because they're more strategically important. And also, I guess, because you can't have a tetrarch spending all their time in Rome anyway, because that's sort of an ideological, it sort of makes things a bit lopsided.
I think it's also part of Diocletian's a policy of devaluing the importance of Rome. It's like the Praetorian Guard are no longer the imperial bodyguard, they're just the garrison of Rome and the Senate.
Yes.
The Council of Rome. The importance, the capitals are where the emperors are now. Their headquarters, Trier, Milan, Nicomedia, and Antioch.
And Nicomedia is sort of that proto-Constantinople because it's right there near the Bosporus as well.
We talk about Galerius.
Yes. I consider him a good emperor. I think on wars alone, he pushes ahead. His military credentials ensure for me that he isn't mediocre, personally, because he does win. His Persian War is arguably the pinnacle of Rome's successes against the Sasanians prior to, the final big war between Heraclius and Khosrow II. It allows Diocletian to impose the Treaty of Nisibis, which basically forces the Sasanians to give up influence over Armenia and Georgia, Iberia, Lazica, Caucasian Albania, modern Azerbaijan. They have to give up 7 trans-Tigritanian satrapies to either the Romans or to vassalized Armenia. It's not clear. So Galerius's victory enables this powerful sort of strategic buffering of the eastern frontier in the Caucasus and in Upper Mesopotamia in quite a major way. And he achieves it through sheer boldness. He was just such a bold general, which I guess I respect. I mean, it's risky, but...
You have to be risky in war.
Yeah, and I mean, so when Narse first invades Upper Mesopotamia, and he clearly takes the Romans by surprise because they have a much smaller army there when suddenly he shows up. And he's sort of trying to relive the glory days of his father, Shapur. He invades, and Bill Ledbetter's analysis of this campaign is quite fascinating because it's often dismissed as a defeat, and but it's more nuanced than that because Galerius does suffer some pretty nasty Christian propaganda that does seem to seep into other sources. And the thing is, so Bill Ledbetter's analysis shows that what actually looks like happened was, so Galerius was there with a much smaller army, and he fought a series of holding actions in Upper Mesopotamia that managed to keep Narse back and prevent him from doing what Shapur would have done, which is then enter Syria, sack Antioch, do all the nasty classic, Sassanid classic mode campaigns that would have happened back in the 260s. And he does get the worst of it, apparently, in the third encounter. So Orosius specifies there were 3 encounters, and that he got the worst of it in the third one. And that produced that whole story about Diocletian making Galerius run before his...
He was defeated at Carrhae, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was somewhere between Carrhae and Callinicum that these actions were happening. And it's clearly a risky area because that's also where Crassus had been defeated, and it's the sort of area where Valerian had been defeated, between Carrhae and Edessa. But it looks like Galerius, with a smaller army, with inferior cavalry, fought this brave holding action in the open plains where Crassus and Valerian had been defeated and did get battered in the third encounter and had to withdraw, but ultimately succeeded in blunting the attack of the Persians. And I think that's something that kind of gets obscured. It does get obscured by the sources and this, strange story about running before the carriage, because I don't believe that for one moment. I think in a world where succession was clearly so volatile, I think it would have been insane for Diocletian to humiliate his Caesar like that. So I personally don't buy that. And I think, and all the sources that mention that, it's all the same tradition. It's all stemming from the Kaisergeschichte. Even Lactantius doesn't mention it, and Lactantius sort of presents Galerius as this brooding, power-hungry figure, and yet he doesn't mention this carriage story. And yet it would make sense to mention it, I think. Then he has to reinforce the army while Diocletian fights the usurpation in Egypt. And then in the middle of winter, marching through the mountains of Armenia, he springs his army upon the Persian camp while they're not suspecting it. And there's even a story about how he personally reconnoitered the camp. There's different versions. There's an Armenian tradition that claims that he literally entered the camp as a cabbage seller.
Yeah.
There's the Latin version, which has him and a couple of other horsemen getting a good look in and then going back to the camp. And there's a third version, a Greek version, which has him enter in the guise of an ambassador. And whether we believe it or not, it's interesting that three different historical traditions with little possibility of interdependence give some version of this story.
Yeah.
But certainly in the 3rd century, emperors were getting more and more into this, well, to prove my military legitimacy, I do have to get kind of a bit into the thick of it a bit more, like Maximinus fought in the... Yeah, Maximinus, we know, as we mentioned, fought in battles personally in the actual fighting, and Gallienus challenged Postumus to one-on-one combat. And so maybe Galerius was, as a career officer turned emperor, understanding the importance of military respect, did what Marcellus, for example, did back in the Second Punic War, which is personally go on the scouting mission, in this case, in the middle of winter in the mountains of Armenia, and then pulled off this grand attack that basically wiped out the Persian army, captured the royal family, captured the Queen of Queens, Arsane, captured sisters, daughters, and other wives of the King of Kings. The King of Kings is wounded and has to flee.
It was a complete disaster for Narses.
Yeah, at least 13 war elephants are captured, according to one source. And then he invades Persia. He just follows up. He chases him. We know from his victory titles that he entered Media Atropatene, he entered Adiabene. He besieged, one source tells us that he besieged Gunda Shapur in Lower Mesopotamia. He entered the vicinity of Ctesiphon. We're not told he took Ctesiphon, but he certainly went past it. And then eventually attacked Nisibis, the very important Upper Mesopotamian fortress, from the southeast. Like, he attacked this fortress from the Persian side and took it, and then basically waited there for the peace envoys at that point. But it's an out there and interesting and pretty successful campaign. We don't have many details, but over multiple years, he defeated the Carpi and resettled them in Roman territory. He also fought a major war against the Sarmatians that also lasted multiple years. The victory titles all attest to this. Each year he was taking Sarmaticus and Carpicus.
I know Jordanes mentions how the Tetrarchs campaigned against, well, he terms them the Goths, but they are Sarmatians, leading these punitive attacks like Aurelian did. And their campaigns are very effective in removing them as threats long term, like the Goths, where they may be in this case, don't show up again until Alaric and that lot.
Well, the Carpi become effectively extinct as a people.
The last of them are settled on Roman territory, and that's the end of them. They disappear.
Yeah, they stop being mentioned. They've basically been resettled. The Carpi and the Vastani are both resettled, in the Balkans, and that basically entails the extinction of their people. And you can see in the victory titles between 301 and 305, he's consistently taking the title Carpicus every year. Yeah. And then between 305 and 308, he's taking Sarmaticus. So the sources don't go into many details, but he's clearly very busy on the Danube frontier. I'll just quickly add his early war. When he first became Caesar, he actually marched into Egypt to put down a revolt in the Thebaid in Upper Egypt.
Yeah.
Again, which was threatening, as we mentioned earlier with Probus, it would have been threatening the Red Sea trade and the mines in the east and the food supply. And in doing so, he also actually fought the Nubians and the Blemmyes, who were the people of the Eastern Desert, who had an organized confederation by now. They had actually formed a proper state by this point in time, and he managed to defeat them. So, yeah, he was very militarily successful.
I actually think it's Diocletian who establishes the forts along the Danube again. I think when they switched, his Galerius takes over the overseeing operation of establishing the new defensive lines along the Danube, because one of Diocletian's new military strategies is, I mean, people call it defense in depth. He's building stone forts rather than just wooden border castles, and they're permanent defensive lines, which eventually the under Constantine get garrisoned by the Limitani and so on. But in this period, it's just regular field forces.
Yeah, archaeology does show that Galerius and Diocletian were both building in the eastern frontier and the Danube frontier a lot of forts, smaller, more defensible stone fortresses all along the borders, and also inland as well, and also in some cases in the Danube beyond as well. You're seeing them in Sarmatia itself as a sort of forward defense / policing fortresses.
Also, it shows the end of the elastic defensive policy of the 3rd century emperors. I was saying with Gallienus that the strategy had moved to try and stop them on the frontiers to being one of taking them out after they've entered Roman territory, back to being fending them off on the frontiers.
Sure, although it's also a sort of a bit of both, I suppose, because the fact that you have these fortresses deeper within the interior as well shows that even if they do get through, they haven't exactly broken the seal. There's still, these fortresses deeper in. And we also know that each tetrarch does seem to have a comitatus imperial field army attached. David Potter actually does argue that the comitatenses, he thinks they first came into being actually under Diocletian. It comes down to the legal evidence that suggests that in 325, when Constantine started legislating on whether the comitatenses, what the retirement benefits of the comitatenses and the limitanae would be, he's doing it for both Licinius's forces and his own, the former forces of Licinius by then, but only a year after he had defeated Licinius. And so Potter argues either, therefore, Constantine and Licinius had together instituted the system of comitatenses and limitanae. Or if we have trouble believing that because Licinius and Constantine didn't have great relations with one another, then actually maybe it was a tetrarchic thing. And then what Constantine did was solidify that arrangement with, for example, the Magistri Militum.
Yeah.
And the sort of, solidifying the structure around what it meant to have comitatenses and what it meant to have limitanae. That's a whole debate, but certainly Galerius and Diocletian were instituting very important defensive reforms on the Danube and in the east. And we know that Diocletian, incidentally, also withdrew the southern frontier in Egypt. He ceded the Dodecus Koinos, just beyond the First Cataract, to the Nubians and set them up as a buffer state against the Blemmyes. And he also gave them both a stipend, both peoples. Yeah. But I suppose, and Galerius, he was also an anti-corruption emperor. We've got edicts of his against the overly rapacious tax collectors and debt collectors. The Caesariani, in particular, who were these imperial agents.
Yes, the secret impotents, yeah.
And we know Diocletian also, Aurelius Victor mentions that Diocletian had done similar edicts against them to try and curb their power a bit. But it's sort of ironic, I suppose, that Galerius has this, reputation for effort to curb corrupt debt collectors and tax collectors, when in fact it does appear to have been his tax policy that caused Maxentius to usurp.
Yes.
Well, that allowed Maxentius to usurp.
That is one of the complaints that Lactantius points it out. At least one of the people that does that. One of the reasons why there's so much support is because of the imposition of taxes. It might also be to do with the fact that Rome, which hadn't been taxed before, now has to pay taxes, which Hadrian tried to do back in the 2nd century and then had to repeal his idea because he had faced so much opposition because of it.
Rome hadn't paid a poll tax since, a tax per head of, number of people in a household. They hadn't paid that since the late Republic, clearly intending to extend Diocletian's increasingly extensively structured taxation program, wanted to bring Rome into the picture and wanted to bring Italy into the picture and make them pull their weight.
Yeah.
And Rome was having none of it. And so, unfortunately for them, Maxentius was present in Rome at the time. And the Senate and the discontented people and the Praetorians, who, Diocletian, as you mentioned, was already whittling down the size of the Praetorian Guard.
Yeah.
And Galerius intended to end it altogether. And the Praetorians knew this. And so you had all these discontented elements within Rome alongside a prince who had not been allowed to become emperor.
Yeah, and they all joined together.
Yeah, I'd actually say that's probably one of the biggest blunders of the Tetrarchic period, is allowing Maxentius to actually live in Rome, because he surely wasn't just living there without their permission. They wouldn't just let a prince. I think it seems that they wanted him to be some kind of, unofficial representative. He's the son of an emperor. He's also the husband. He's the son-in-law of Galerius, the son of Maximian. So he represents both East and West. This is another Bill Ledbetter argument. He's a member of the senatorial class. And so he's there to kind of represent imperial interests, but in a way that the tetrarchs themselves, Maximian doesn't have to go there himself, because that would sort of, Olivier Hexter argues that would sort of throw out the ideological balance to have a single tetrarch in Rome itself.
Yeah.
And yet it's quite the blunder, because Maxentius was clearly not just some pushover. He wasn't going to let it stand that he wasn't succeeding to the throne. And that's partly Diocletian's problem, but then Galerius makes it worse by trying to tax these people. And he also sets up Severus as the emperor in Italy. And prosopographical studies show that Severus was essentially taking control with a bunch of Balkan officials in an environment where Italians had been king. Maximian had used Italians as as many of his officials were Italians. He was playing to the local base. And then Galerius puts poor Severus into this position of ruling Italy with all these Balkan loyalists. So you could certainly say that Galerius mishandled Italy in a way that almost guaranteed the collapse of the Imperial College. And certainly it is unambiguously the case that Galerius failed to hold the Imperial College together. He made some attempts by trying to get Diocletian to bring things together at the Conference of Carnuntum. He even invited Diocletian to retake power, which Maximian did as well in attempting to get him on his side. Yeah. And so I guess it's difficult. Galerius sort of fails once he's an Augustus.
He is a good follower, but when he's in charge, although he's not a complete know-nothing when it comes to running the empire, and he does take on the kind of father-eight figure that Diocletian had once been. To his credit, and also to the Tetrarchy's credit as a effective system, is that you have all of the instability from 306 to 308, but then you have this extraordinary event where the rivals of various factions come together to sort out what they're going to do, and then they actually abide by it for the next 3 years until Galerius dies. So Constantine is recognized as an emperor. Magnentius gets a bit short shrift, but
yes,
Maximian is persuaded to step down. Diocletian returns home, and everything seems to be fine. Galerius stays in power, Maximinus are lesser, but that's because there aren't any problems in the East.
The Carnuntum settlement is interesting because it also shows that Galerius was flexible when he needed to be, because, yeah, he sets up Licinius as the Augustus in the West, and Licinius is tasked with bringing an end to Maxentius. He's clearly not going to allow Maxentius any leeway, but I think in his mind, probably Maxentius, to give in to Maxentius at this point it'd be a political disaster to do that. Constantine could claim, well, my father made me the successor and the soldiers want me. And I guess Galerius, we know that he handled that fairly well because he accepted it, but he also made clear, okay, but you're Caesar and Severus will be the Augustus in the West. And Constantine accepted that. And then after Carnuntum, Constantine refused to accept being demoted to Caesar because Maximian had already promoted him to Augustus as part of their alliance. And so he wasn't willing to be demoted back to Caesar, which is what Galerius wanted to do. And eventually in 310, Galerius, again, showing, some flexibility, recognized, well, let's just silently start acknowledging Constantine as Augustus. And let's also do the same with Maximinus, because Maximinus himself was not happy that Licinius had been made Augustus ahead of him when Licinius hadn't even been a Caesar.
Yeah, and he fought Augustus in 310.
Yeah, and ultimately Galerius acknowledges that.
Yeah.
He can't embitter the only other ally he has other than Licinius. Making Licinius Augustus ahead of Maximinus is a bit of a controversial move, but
perhaps Flight is being overly affected by hindsight, but you can see the Tetrarchy that Diocletian set up no longer working, and circumstances have changed. And so Galerius is pragmatically trying to make it work without leading to a civil war. And I think it's successful. Okay, now there are 4 Augusti and 2 people proclaiming themselves emperor that shouldn't be. Alexander and Africa. Keep saying Maxentius in Italy. But on the whole, you've got 4 emperors, which they're all Augusti now, but they are running their parts of the empire. They're not attacking anyone. For the rest of Galerius's life, for the next 3 years, they pretty much stay in that position.
Well, yeah, and also the very last thing he does is a show of political pragmatism, which is the Edict of Toleration towards the Christians. Despite being apparently a pretty zealous persecutor himself, who supposedly is the one who persuaded Diocletian into the Great Persecution, he eventually does seem to realize, perhaps this is because by then he was literally decaying, because he had that horrible disease that saw his genitals sort of rot and his bowels decaying, and supposedly it was, and in that context, that's when he issued the Edict of Toleration. So maybe he genuinely thought, okay, there's a God out there. It's not necessarily what the Christian God is. Well, the pagans believed in other people's gods. They just didn't think they were the only gods generally.
Yeah.
But presumably in his mind, okay, this God is angry with me and this persecution hasn't achieved anything. Let's end it.
Or at least in the historical record, it's framed as he issues this Edict of Toleration and then asks the Christians to pray to their God for him. So it's kind of wish me luck, lads, in the next life kind of thing.
Like he understood it was better to have the Christians praying to their God for the emperor rather than not praying at all and being in hiding.
Yeah.
He also, incidentally, is the first tetrarch until eventually Constantine to return imperial women to a position of prominence. He makes his wife Galeria Valeria, who was the daughter of Diocletian, so she was a prestigious figure, makes her into an Augusta, and coins all throughout the eastern half of the empire honor her as Augusta. And he actually also deifies his mother, Romula. And there's even a story that he claimed that Romula had a visit from Mars, and that's why he was who he was. He basically used an Alexander myth, supposedly, to strengthen his own legitimacy.
I suppose it's also copying Diocletian a little bit, Viani and Herculani.
Yeah, it is. It's taking it a little further, but it is certainly in the same ballpark, that sort of divine emperorship. Appointing Licinius is a bit of a controversial move because he hadn't been Caesar, but then again, I suppose he didn't think he could just move Maximinus from the east. Licinius was an emperor without territory, really.
Yeah.
Until Maxentius was going to be defeated, he didn't really have his own
Well, he
lands.
would
And
have
so it's a sort
owned
of,
Illyricum.
yeah, I guess he would have had Pannonia. Yeah, Illyricum, Pannonia. But it's sort of kind of falling within the Balkan realm of Galerius in a way. He's not that separated from Galerius.
Yeah.
Who was to become the new Augustus in the West must have been a difficult choice. And he clearly couldn't pick Constantine because Constantine had sided with Maximian. And so
Not politic to assign someone who had just proclaimed themselves emperor rather than being appointed.
Constantine occupies a space between it's okay to allow him to continue to be emperor, but it's another thing to reward him.
It's a little bit like Valentinian II later in the 4th century, where it's like he is legitimate in pretty much every respect, except how he became emperor is a bit dodgy.
But I guess overall, I consider him a good emperor. I think he clearly had a tough job ahead of him once he succeeded Constantius as senior ranking emperor. But he had a tough job and he made mistakes. But he was pragmatic. And I think for me, his military achievements are such that I have to ultimately go with good.
I would agree. I think he is good. He's militarily very successful, and he does seem to be a canny administrator as well. Although he does make some political errors and is also responsible for the Christian persecution, he is also good at, as you say, be flexible, be willing to compromise for the good of the empire or for himself, but he is willing to change his policies to meet the reality rather than what he would like to happen. And I think it is to his credit that he is able to make the Tetrarchy last until his death. And so he is, in some respects, a spiritual successor to Diocletian. And it's only after he dies that it starts to break apart again, now that all of the original Tetrarchs are dead. So that is the Tetrarchy. In our last chat, we'll be talking about the second Tetrarchy, so Severus, Maximinus, the usurper Alexander, Maxentius, Licinius, and Constantine as Tetrarch. And I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Byron, for coming on again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. And I thank you everyone for watching. And this has been Eastern Roman History.